Morning. So we're here in times of drought for a lot of Australia, and it's actually been quite a bad fire season. Some of you may have noted we've missed a couple of live sessions because a lot of our team has been out fighting fires, and it's been a bit of a dire time, and I'm happy to say that because of the efforts of the Hive team here, we have actually managed to save a bunch of houses in the valley that I grew up in. It's been quite intense, but that's I guess something that happens when you get a really dry time. Now, bees, they obviously need nectar, water and pollen to survive. So if your bees are in a time of drought, then you may need to feed them in order for them to survive until such time as there's more flowers again. So today we're going to run through a few different options of how to feed your bees, quick and easy feeders you can make, and also just discuss a bit about the different ways and why one would feed your bees. So to start off, bees need nectar. That's their carbohydrate source that they then store as honey. They reduce the water content down to below 20% so they can store it for in times when there's no flowers, whether it be drought or winter. So the bees will be busy doing that, but if they haven't managed to store enough, or there's not enough nectar, then they might not have enough to survive. Now, bees of course are better off foraging on natural sources, on flowers that they've evolved to forage on, and bringing in that nectar and those pollen into the hive. But if it's a case of your bees starving, then you're going to be better off feeding them than letting them starve. Around here, we are still blessed with a subtropical climate, and even though we're in a drought time here, we still have flowers. The flowers you see in this beautiful garden have actually been watered. If you look beyond this, out into the hills, you'll see it's quite brown and dry. Nevertheless, we still get enough here to have flowers to keep our bees going. So in this region, we don't need to feed. The best information to find out whether you need to feed your bees might be from your local beekeepers. Now, the most common thing to feed your bees is sugar. Sugar, being sucrose, is the closest mimic we've got to the flower nectar, and it's best to use refined sugar. Even though you might think to go and buy some raw organic sugar, it actually has other things in it that may not necessarily be good for your bees and could cause dysentery. So pure white sugar is what you want, and there's various different ways to feed, and we'll run through that now. So to find out whether you need to feed, have a look at whether there's any stores in your hive. Now, looking in this window, I can see they've still got stores here. I can see honey. They have started to eat a section away here. You can see there's the section they've started to eat, and I can actually see some nectar glistening in the cells, showing they've found some nectar now and starting to fill it up again. Over here you've got stores. So this hive you wouldn't need to feed. However, if they had nothing, it might be a good idea to feed them. Again, consult with your local beekeepers to find that out. If you want to make an emergency feeder, as in you don't have time to do anything else, but you really need to get some form of sugar to your bees, then I'll just show you a quick way to do that. Now, that's called dry sugar feeding. So it's most popular to make up a solution to mimic nectar, but you can actually use just dry sugar like this. 1/2 kilo to 1 kilo on top of your inner cover. Pop out the cap and the bees will come up and start to eat that if they need it. And the idea is you just pour it on top like this, make a bit of a mound, and the bees will get into that and start to consume that. They will need water to be able to do that, so we'll cover feeding your bees water soon. The idea would be you'd pop out that inner cover like that. A few bees will come out, so you want to be in your bee seat, and then put the lid back on, and the bees can then consume that sugar. I actually don't want them to consume the sugar, so I'm going to put this cap right back again. It's just for demonstration purposes, because if your bees are storing honey, you don't really want to be feeding them sugar, because sugar will then get stored in your frames, meaning your honey will have a sugar content, which isn't necessarily the best thing. Then that goes back on top like that, and away your bees go, consuming some of that sugar. It's more popular to do liquid feeding, and there's various different solutions depending on what you want to do. So you can make a feeder like this. So you mix up your sugar syrup, and there's a few different ratios, and I'll cover that now. A ratio of 1:1 by volume, so half of this sugar, the other half water, is a typical feed if you're wanting to simulate nectar and stimulate brood, stimulate the queen to lay and get more brood. Now that's something beekeepers will do leading up to a big flowering. So that's come from the commercial beekeeping, where they're trying to maximise their honey yield, and they'll give their bees a head start prior to a big flowering, so they start getting lots of brood, lots of bees. When there's a big flowering, means lots more honey stored. So that'd be a 1:1 solution if you're trying to do that. However, if you're trying to get the bees to store honey prior to winter, or perhaps in a time of de-earth, it gets called, or time where there's no flowers, then a 2:1, so more sugar, twice as much sugar as water solution, is more typical if you want the bees to store the honey. It's less of a stimulus to start laying. Now, in times of drought, you don't necessarily want your colony to grow. You actually, if they grow, then they'll consume more of the honey stores that are in the hive, and then they'll be in more of an issue. So better off not stimulating them to lay a whole lot of eggs, which means putting, say, the 2:1 solution, 2 parts sugar to 1 part water. Now you'll need to heat that water up. It's good to keep everything sterile, because you don't want to have yeasts and things in your jar. Fermentation can and will occur in your sugar solutions, especially in the 1:1 solution. And when fermentation occurs, then the bees can get dysentery from that. So if you notice it going sour or bubbly, then discard it. You don't want to feed your bees fermenting sugar water solution. So for that reason, only mix up how much you want to use, and that way that's less likely to hang around and go fermented. Now, a strong colony could consume all of this in a couple of days if they needed to store. However, they may not, so it's a case of gauging how much they're consuming to know how much to mix up next time. If you've got any questions, put them in the comments below and we'll get to answering them. I'll just go through and fill you in on a couple more different types of feeders. Now this is a simple feeder type. All I've done is drill some holes in the top of this jar here. And what will happen is when I turn that upside down, a little bit spills out, but then it stops because of the airlock. And the bees will then suck through those holes, provided we put this jar over the top of the hole in the inner cover, which I'll do now for you. So the lid comes off, and again the inner cover will come off. Sorry, the plug in the inner cover will come off. Then it's a case of turning over your jar and putting the holes you've drilled right over that hole, so the bees can then suck that up. Just like that. Now the bees will be able to get to the sugar solution. So that's a very simple feeder. Of course, if you have a tall jar like this, you'll need to cover this up with another box before your roof goes on. So you'll need a spare bee box if you want to use a full 2 litre jar like that. If you don't have a spare bee box, then you can make a simple feeder using a much smaller jar like this, which will fit under the roof. You can see all I've done to create this is get a nail, typical ones that come with the kit to put your brood frames together, and I've just punched holes from the backside, and again you've got a simple feeder. The bees can suck the sugar water solution out of that if you place it over the hole like so. So there's a very simple feeder if you want to make sure your bees have a little bit of sugar water to keep them going if you're fearing that they don't have enough honey stores and they don't have nectar available. There's another type of feeder you can use, and that's very quick and easy to make using a Ziploc bag. Now, the Ziploc bag feeder, basically you put your sugar syrup in there, you put it on top, then you get a pin and you just punch some holes in here. The bees will come up through the hole in the inner cover and start sucking on those holes and eventually suck all of the sugar syrup solution out of the bag. If you've got any questions, put them in the comments below. We'll get to answering them soon. Now, there's another type of feeder you can make. It's called an open feeder, and I'll go through that now. There's some controversy whether open feeding is a good idea. Our DPI, the Department of Primary Industry here in Australia, says there is no issues regarding disease issues or robbing issues by performing open feeding. So we'll go through that now. You get some kind of tub or container, depending on whether this is probably more suited if you've got a lot of hives, and you might go 100 metres out in front of your hives. Make yourself a nice tub using some kind of trough, or this would probably be a little bit small. If you had 20 or so hives, you'd need to make a bigger feeder. But the idea is you simply pour your sugar water solution onto your tray or tub like that. But if you just leave it like that, what's going to happen is a lot of bees will come and they'll start to drown in that solution. So what you'll need to do is give them some way to stay afloat as they suck on that sugar water. So you can do that using a bit of straw or pine needles or all sorts of things, just by covering it up like that, and that way the bees can stand on that as they suck on the solution. Now, it can take a while for the bees to actually find this and recognise it as a source of nectar or sugar. So to help them find this, you may need to spray a little bit of the sugar water solution on the entrances of your hives to get them a bit of a taste for it, get them looking for that smell. So that's an open feeder that you could try. The advantages are, if you've got a lot of hives, you could have one big open feeder, and that'll save you time and money on making or buying a whole lot of feeders for every hive. Here's another type of feeder again. Now this type of feeder is popular in beekeeping. That goes into the hole in the inner cover. The bees, you put the solution in here, the bees climb up here, and it's got a little kind of ridged surface to it, and the bees can walk up and down and start sucking on the nectar. There's a little cap that goes over here, which I can't find at present, and that stops the bees getting in and drowning into the solution. So they just stay in this zone here, and then the lid goes on top. The advantage of this type of feeder is you can put it inside the roof, and you can top up your feed without actually any bees escaping. The one disadvantage is it's got a little bit too much height for these roofs, and the roof will sit up just a little bit, about like that. It's not a major problem, but it will sit up just a tiny bit. So there's a few different types of feeders for feeding sugar to your bees. Again, if your bees are starving, the hive's really light, you can't see any honey, you know there's no flowers out there because it's so dry, or there's a de-earth because of a winter or so on, then do feed your bees rather than let them starve. Now, the other thing bees need is water. So water can be fed to bees using a tray of water, or there's all sorts of ways to do it, but the main thing is to give the bees something to stand on. So here we have just one of our Flow Hive 2 trays that's been sitting around, and Trace has put some pebbles in here so the bees can stand on the pebbles as they suck up the water. They do like something to stand on, they don't like just kind of falling into the water and potentially drowning. The other thing bees need is minerals. So you'll often find bees sucking on mud or sucking on sand or sucking on things that you go, why aren't they choosing the clean water? They're going and choosing this dirty water. And that's because bees need minerals, specifically salt. So another thing you can do when you're putting out water for your bees is add a little salt to it. So in a 2 litre jar like I was holding just before, just put a teaspoon of salt in there. Any salt will do. It doesn't have to be pink Himalayan rock salt. And the bees will preference that over another water source. Fred Dunn did some great experiments about that. I believe the video is called Bees Need Minerals, and he did some experiments shifting water sources around, some with salt and some without, and found that the bees would follow the salty water because they preferred it over the fresh water. And that's why you will get bees coming to drink in swimming pools that are salty. They will sit on the edge. So perhaps if you've got an issue with that and you need, you might need to put out some salty water for your bees so they don't go so much to the neighbour's pool. So it is important in times of drought that the bees have some form of water source. They will fly far to get it. The last job in a bee's life is collecting water. Those bees' job is then dedicated to water collection to bring back into the hive to help cool your hive. And also if you've put a whole lot of sugar on the top of the hive, they will need some water to help turn that into something closer to nectar. The next thing to discuss is pollen. Now, bees need pollen also, but they don't need pollen to survive, they need pollen to reproduce. So what the bees do with pollen, they bring it into the hive and they pack it into the cells, and then they ferment it into bee bread using enzymes. They make their own kind of sourdough. Now, they then consume the bee bread in order to then excrete royal jelly, which they feed to the baby larvae. Now, that's the reason why they need a lot of pollen. So if you plan on feeding your bees pollen, what you'll probably do is stimulate those bees to lay more eggs and breed up in size, which might not be what you want to do in times of drought when you know there's not much nectar for a long time. So feeding pollen patties and things is more of a technique to get the bees to really breed up in lieu of a good nectar flow coming. However, if you've got views contrary to that, please put it in the comments below. Perhaps some beekeepers like to feed a little bit of pollen to keep them ticking over if there's nothing around. Now, looking at the entrance is a good way to see whether there's pollen coming in. If you sit there for a while and watch and have a look, if the bees are bringing in pollen on their legs, then you don't need to provide them a pollen source. The other way is getting into your hive, having a look for pollen in the frames. If you're not seeing any pollen, then perhaps they're a bit starved of pollen sources. Any questions? Fire away.
Chad has a pool in his backyard and doesn't want his bees to drown. What should he do?
Okay, so the best thing might be to provide a separate water source for your bees. If you find a lot of bees are drinking, we do get it around the edge of this pool. We don't get that many drowned bees. It's not a major issue because they tend to hang on to the edges and have a lick down. There's a nice rough surface here for them to hang on to. But you might like to try making a feeder like this with a little bit of salt in it to help make that the preferred source to your bees.
Do the bees ever put pollen in the honey super?
Bees will very occasionally put pollen in the honey seed, but they tend to keep it much closer to the brood nest. In the brood nest you'll find you've got typically a whole lot of brood at various different stages in the centre, and as you go further out you'll get pollen stores and then honey stores on the outside. Now occasionally you'll find a little bit of pollen in your flow frames. I have seen it only very rarely.
Rochelle is asking, would you recommend one-to-one feeding to stimulate drawing comb?
Okay, so to stimulate drawing comb, if someone's got a solid answer to that, put it in the comments below. It could be a way. My thinking on that would be a one-to-one solution would stimulate a lot of eggs to be laid, because it's simulating a nectar flow on. So it's simulating that there's a good nectar flow on, a lot more eggs will be getting laid and the colony will be expanding, in which case they will start to draw comb as well, as they need to expand into and complete cells and store honey, etc. We've got time for a couple more questions.
Brian's wondering if using the feeder would also help to draw bees into the flow frames.
Okay, my answer for that is probably not much. So although you'd have a bit of foot traffic going from the bottom box to the top if you had a feeder up here, I've found people who put sugar water on their flow frames as a method of getting them up there. It's a very short-lived thing where the bees just run up there and lick the sugar water and disappear again. Whereas if you put wax on the flow frames or a bit of burr comb from the brood box, then you'll find they will start chewing that away and redistributing it on the flow frame surfaces, and that'll be a faster way to get activity on the flow frames if you're trying to speed that up. Another question.
Wendy's asking, will bees lick at solid salt or does it always have to be in liquid form?
If someone knows the answer to that, you can put it in the comments below. I haven't seen them licking solid salt. I think it would be too strong for them, so it would be more in a liquid form as part of your feeder, water feeder. Thank you very much for watching and tuning in. If you've got any more questions, you can continue to put them in the comments below, and also let us know what you'd like us to cover next week. And best of luck if you're in a drought affected area, and if you're in a fire affected area, then please be safe. Make sure you look after yourself and steer clear if a fire is nearby.